Hello there. It's May. It's the 8th of May 2019. Now, today we're going to touch on a subject. Now, sometimes when I sit here, I've got to tell you, and probably you already know, that I know nothing about what I'm speaking of. I'm just trying to read it or collect it together. In fact, I met a man the other day who said, "Oh yes, you're the fellow who shuffles the paper on Broadcasting Scotland." And I said, "Yes, that's me." And today is one of those subjects where I'm not really clued in 100%, but fortunately I do have a guest, and I will introduce you to him in a minute. You can see him sitting there. That's Peter, but we'll talk to Peter in a second. But this show comes out of some things that happened over the weekend and various press reports about people on the internet saying things or typing things and leaving messages. Now, it is a bother, but one thing in my head says, well, it's always been a bother because people will always be nasty. But of course, now we get a situation where you've got a very easy thing. People have got their mobile phones in their pockets and it's easy to pick them out. And if you're fed up with somebody or something, you can shout abuse at them using your keyboard and be fairly anonymous at doing it. And I suppose until you do something that's really over offensive, people are just going to, well, they've got other things to deal with. So a lot of people get away with it. Now, it's not very nice, but apparently there was a lady a little time ago, just at the beginning of May, so about a week ago, Emma Clifford Bell was her name, and she was looking to get some people to balance out a show. Now, some of the people who are watching this, if we've got anybody watching, I hope we have, often say about the BBC being biased for this and biased for that, but she was looking for some people. She'd already found some indie peoples to support her show, and she was looking for some unionists. And then she's, well, apparently been abused over the Twitter thing, and she got a bit upset by that. And then there was something else on the Herald last week, I think on the 5th of May, and they were talking about this thing called Cybernats, and it was the SNP declares war on Cybernats. Now, I've got to say that I've been interested in what the SNP do for quite some time, and I don't think they ever really declare war on anybody, and often the newspapers try to drum up a story and try to make something a little bit more than it is. And certainly some people who are mentioned in this story I do know personally, and I do know that they would not be doing this, and then what they've done, what they've said, and how other people interpret what they've said is what's causing this. So now I do have an expert with me, because this gentleman, I've been told, although it's really the first time we've met and we've been talking about other things rather than this story, this is Peter. Peter, please introduce yourself. There's your camera over there. Tell everybody that you're Peter Curran. Well, you don't have to say that, I've just said it.
Yep.
But your experience with Cybernats is kind of like an history of this thing, I think.
Let me start off first with a declaration. I'm happy to be called a Cybernat. Cybernat is a simple factual word that was coined. Who coined it, I don't know. But it means a nationalist, in other words, an independent supporter who operates and makes his or her contribution in cyberspace, which predominantly means social media these days. So Cybernat in itself is a neutral term. However, it was probably coined by those who do not favour independence as a pejorative term. Now, quite simply, the social media has done something which I think most people rejoice in, certainly the vast majority of people accept, but a key number of people, notably a key number of professions, are deeply suspicious of social media because it's done something that has never been done in human history ever before. It's given the common man and woman a voice, an instantaneous response voice to talk back to power. And that voice is a voice that's always been there, but when it's expressed in the limitations of tapping it out on a keyboard, it can often manifest itself in exceptional ways.
Yeah, so this is absolutely fascinating, actually. Now, let's fill some of this out and make this thing you've started us off on, and give it a bit more background. Now, first of all, you and I are both musicians.
Yes.
And we have both, at times, been paid to do that job.
Yes.
And a wonderful tie with some staves on it and a few crotchets and semiquavers there, and braces as well, belt braces there. Now, of course, when I was a younger man, and you're unfortunately a little bit older than me.
I'll be 84 next birthday.
So 84, so I'm 20 years younger, really,
yeah.
Thereabouts. And so when I was in the earlier days of my career in dealing with EMI records and various other records, it was Pi Records was one of the people I was with, and blah, blah, blah. But in those days, the people who controlled the machinery, the studio where you could be not, it was only the music that could be heard, no cars or anything or background noises. So that was one big part of it. So you could record in a silent place, and then they had to have the big tape machines where it could multi-track and blah blah blah. So those people then controlled the actual physical discs, and those people. And of course, all that stuff cost money, a lot of money. So young folks like me, and some of my seniors, possibly you too, we couldn't afford to have all that technology. So what we've done now, we've got a situation where you and I couldn't have put a record out on our own back in those days. I mean, maybe a cassette tape, but that didn't really sound that good, did it? And so you move now to a situation where you've actually sort of taken the recording company and you've put it in everybody's pockets.
Absolutely.
And everybody can publish, everybody can push it out there to the wide world.
And quite a few have made millions from that process.
Yeah, I wonder how you do that. I was trying to do that bit myself. You didn't try that either.
Well, there's an old saying that basically all professions are a conspiracy against the laity. And in a sense, politicians, broadcasters, journalists have had the ability to communicate one way, backed by expensive technology and big money. So it's what my American employers, American industry for 14 years, used to call megaphone diplomacy or megaphone communication. Only they could afford the megaphone, and they would bellow their views, opinions, etc. at the audience. And the audience out there could respond. If they were in a crowd, you can imagine somebody, a politician on a podium shouting at the audience, and the voice from the crowd shouting various things, including a considerable amount of abuse, as they used to do. But it was all muted because the technology was all on one side. The journalistic profession, the newspaper profession, the media in general, and the politicians have never recovered from the shock of hearing the people speak to them en masse on equal terms and often faster.
Even though you've given everybody the technology so they've got a voice, the publishing of it still is a problem. Because if everybody has a machine, you're no longer one or two shouting in the crowd, are you? You're actually shouting in out of billions because everybody else has got. Now, how do you get your voice above the parapet? How do you get it out there? And of course, the newspapers simultaneously are trying to get their voices heard. And so, obviously, if they've got, the jeopardy always brings people, and confrontation always brings people. In former days, when I used to teach people a bit about drama, I used to say to them, well, it's usually a conflict. And we either look at the conflict and just look at it, or we look at the conflict and try and solve it, or we look at the conflict and blah, blah. So it is conflict that draws people's attention, and it is jeopardy that draws people's attention. And what people who are running newspapers, they've got to sell their newspapers and sell their advertising space. So obviously they want to find a problem. And this gives them an ideal problem, doesn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, none of this is new. I mean, you can go back to the Herstein newspapers, the yellow journalism of the United States. And this, in a sense, was examined, what is it now, almost 80 years ago in Citizen Kane, the famous Orson Welles movie. and it was based clearly on William Randolph Hearst. But at that time, they exploited all of these things. They exploited unjustifiable attacks on people, anything that would sell newspapers. That there was no higher objective in it, despite the fact that the American press collectively was, and still is, some of the most admirable press in the world in terms of their journalistic things, that the Fourth Estate really means something in the US. As we saw, I mean, the Washington Post, a small family-owned newspaper essentially, brought down a president.
Richard Nixon.
And took some appalling risks as journalists to tell the truth to power at the ultimate level, to the commander-in-chief himself. So I've never been a journalist. I very early
Maybe
on.
you could give us a little bit, because obviously there will be people who don't know your backstory and don't know how you got into this, because there was, you made a blog, or what was it that you actually did, and
well,
how did the controversy come to it and to you?
Well, going back, I was a lifelong Labour supporter. I was born into a classic Glasgow East End Labour supporting family. Everything revolved around it. A large percentage of the church I went to would automatically have defaulted to Labour values. There was a general undercurrent. It was very much Labour within the union. We were brought up within the whole framework of the union. And I had head down most of my life. My father died when I was 5, and my mother was a widow, had no skills. So I went to a senior secondary school in Glasgow, St Mungo's Academy. In fact, I went to a primary school where the headmaster had founded Glasgow Celtic.
Oh, wow.
So that was another theme in my family. I have to say I'm not a football supporter in any shape or form. So I was catapulted out to work at 15 and had to and spent my life more or less head down, trying to make a living, trying to make a career with a general awareness of politics. But by the time it came to Blair, I rejoiced in the Blair government coming in, and Tony Blair, and enthusiastically, did such campaigning as I could for him, and then was very rapidly realised that I had made the biggest political mistake of my life. If ever I had picked a wrong horse, it was Tony Blair. And the lead up to the Iraq War was one of my first essays into the media. I wrote a letter to the Herald, seriously worried before they were about to invade Iraq, saying I now had a deep distrust of not only Tony Blair but Gordon Brown, and they were about to unleash something awful in what was always a cauldron of political activity, but would become a maelstrom if they weren't careful.
So when was this? Would it have been about
2003,
1991-ish?
2003.
This is 2003.
Yeah, I mean, Blair was 1997. But I was almost immediately disenchanted with the Bernie Ecclestone thing, the funding thing, and generally looked harder at Blair and thought that this guy's wrong for any values that I have. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to make the Labour Party electable. He'd succeeded in doing that. I was delighted initially. But when I saw the direction they were going in, I got deeply worried. So anyway, I voted SNP for the first time at the 2007 Holyrood elections, not in any expectancy that they would win. Was astonished when they won, and then began to put my toe very cautiously into social media.
So you actually got a computer, and then you started to, Facebook?
Well, I'd been in business
what was it then? I get a bit confused with the dates, as I just did it a few moments ago, when things happen, because it's so much has happened in the last few years, hasn't it?
Well,
because we haven't had Facebook long.
No.
I was performing at the Fringe in Edinburgh, I think, when I first saw that.
Well, when I came to social media, blogging was just coming about.
Blogging.
Yeah.
So it wasn't Facebook, it was blogging.
No, but YouTube was relatively early in the game.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I've certainly been on YouTube since 2009.
Yeah.
And it was in the game before that. So there were some pioneers of the game who seem to have vanished now and were forgotten. Among them, one who operated under the pseudonym, grand pseudonym of Baron Sarwar of Govan. I don't think he had any connection to the Sarwars. And he was putting up videos, and I thought, this is wonderful, so I'll investigate this YouTube thing. And as it happened, my own old constituency, Glasgow East, it was coming up to be contested. And I made my first video, which I posted, which is essentially still shots of Glasgow and a voiceover commentary from me. It was very well received and got big hits and put me in touch with people all over the world. And I was astonished at the power of the medium.
So that was you into the game, and then obviously you continued that. Now, when did things start to go awry? When did people start to attack you, if you like? Is that the right word?
Well, I was never... I had vigorous posts. Having rashly explained that I was a saxophone player, I have had advice in the most graphic terms of how I should dispose of my saxophone. Now, some of it was gynecologically possible with a clarinet, which is a long, straight instrument, but with a curved brass instrument with a wide bell at the end, it would have been quite impossible to fulfill the request. But I never took that too seriously or too personally.
So, how did you feel when you first saw a negative against you?
Well, I'm an East End Glaswegian. And I have to say, I have certain
watch for the ducks back.
If you'll forgive this, as blunt as this, we had an old maxim. People are often much nicer if you boot them in the balls on first meeting and then help them up and say it doesn't have to be like that. So there was an element of...
Yeah, and let's go back to the entertaining bit, because when I was discussing this before you got here, I said, well, if you do what I do, you kind of learn to have a thick skin before before you've done the first show, because that's the way it is. And if you don't get a thick skin, you're not going to survive. So that was one small element that was interesting to me.
Well, indeed. I wouldn't say I have a thick skin. I would say over the years it's been overlaid with scar tissue, and they find it difficult to find an insertion point for the knife.
The nerve endings disappear underneath.
My political education was largely going to the Glasgow Barrows, the market, the Petticoat Lane market of Glasgow. And it had wonderful soapbox orators in the post-war era. These were servicemen who had come back determined to change the world, had changed the world by electing the Attlee government. I was delivering leaflets it was actually for the ILP. It was for Jimmy Maxson, a very...
Independent Labour Party.
Yes, fascinating, admirable man who I knew personally as a schoolboy, because his constituency office was a few yards from my school. And I was delivering leaflets at the age of 10, running about in the running boards, that's how long, of old Austin taxis, vote ILP, and helping old ladies into polling station. Now, the Glasgow soapbox orators were vigorous. They were very vigorous in their language because they knew their audience. The audience responded to the vigour with equal vigour in return. Four-letter words and even more complex variants were used in abundance, and nobody was unduly offended by it.
So heckling is the word they use now, isn't it?
Heckling was a fine art form.
How do you relate what we've been discussing here with these cybernats? Is it relatable to heckling?
Yes, absolutely. In a sense, especially Twitter. Twitter is a medium which is very different from all the other media, to use the proper plural in the media. Twitter, especially in its initial limitations of 140 characters, forced you to be pithy, cut yourself down to the essence of what you wanted to say, and say it vigorously with a core point. Now, that wasn't my style. I'd been a blogger, and I typically churned out 6,500 word blogs. Long blog, sometimes 2 a day in my early... over the piece, since 2005 to now, I've written 2 books. I'd planned to write more. But I've written 2 million words of blogs, I have to say, none of which were remunerated, simply to fill a gap against the mass of the unionist media. So early blogs, pre-Facebook, I wasn't the only blogger, there were other fine bloggers, and some very responsible people, and I can only pay tribute to who I regard as a sort of doyen of the online Bella Caledonia, Mike Small, who oddly enough is experiencing his own problems of abuse at the moment. So I don't underrate the problem. But Twitter is a very, very different medium. And I was switched on to Twitter by an Irish blogger, very influential Irish blogger called Mike Fealty, who has a blogging site called Slugger O'Toole. Couldn't get more Irish than that. And Mike somehow was commissioned to put on a workshop in 2010 in Edinburgh, which was called PyCam, pi as in the mathematical symbol. And he introduced me and a hell of a lot of others. He said, don't dismiss Twitter as a trivial medium. Twitter is an astonishingly powerful medium. It allows ordinary people to come in. It's not really a debating medium, but it is a medium to hear the voice of the people. And he emphasized at the time, the voice of the people is a raw, unmoderated voice. And if you attempt to moderate it beyond a certain point, then you lose something vital. Because if people are hurting because of politics and social pressures, and they're given an opportunity to vent that hurt, they will do it vigorously.
Yeah. People are hurt, aren't they? I mean, I often say that when you deal with folk, you're really dealing with the fear they've built up over the years of things that have happened to them. Criticism's always a harsh thing. Yeah. And if you haven't got the depth of character to handle it, well, lashing out is one of the things that is a response, and it can be a physical thing, and people fall into fighting with each other, or they can, in this way, with the Twitter, they can shout and scream and get it off their chest.
Yeah, and people in that position, Lewis, are often primed explosive charges, just needing something to set them off. I mean, I used to tell an old story in my consultancy business to illustrate the dangers of psyching yourself up to a negative, which I called the carjack story. And the carjack story, I'll try and be brief on it, runs something like this. Travelling salesman, lonely road at night, finds he has a flat tyre. He's out in a rural area, he gets out, goes into the boot, and he has no jack. So he said, my God, how am I going to change the wheel? And he looks up the hill and he sees a lonely farmer, single light, way up the hill. So he trudges up the hill. As he's going up, he thinks, God, the farmer, hard-working man, he'll have been up since all hours, and he's in bed enjoying a well-earned rest. It's an isolated area. He's going to be worried about intruders. God knows what his reaction will be. He may be enjoying his conjugal rights. Anything may be going on. So he gets to the door in this mood, and he knocks on the door. And after a moment, a light goes on upstairs, and the farmer looks out and says, can I help you, sir? And the travelling salesman shakes his fist and says, take your jack and shove it. He'd been actually psyched up to expecting a negative reaction. And a lot of that is what happens and triggers abuse on Twitter.
What actually happened in your story about, I mean, there was some, I mean, I've only got a vague notion, but there was a difficulty between what you were doing and some other people?
In relation to this latest controversy.
The BBC, wasn't it?
Oh, the BBC, yes. Well, when I entered the posting videos thing, the first video, as I said, I posted on YouTube, I'd made it. It was entirely mine. It was my copyright. But I was never under any illusions that YouTube made it abundantly clear that you couldn't breach copyright. You either had to have the permission of the copyright holder, or you had to own the copyright. It was as simple as that, or you would have a strike. So I walked warily initially, and then I realized other people were clipping. So I thought, well, I'll try cautiously clipping, and I'll clip the BBC because it's a public service broadcast. I don't want to go over all this old ground, which was covered in Broadcasting Scotland at the time. So over the years, from 2009 up till last year, I'd built up something like 2,600 videos in my YouTube channel, 95% BBC. Now, occasionally the BBC through YouTube would send a copyright warning, But it was always accompanied by the dual statement, providing you do not monetize this claim, in other words, you're not making money out of it from YouTube, and providing you do not permit embedding, in other words, you don't allow people to take your clip, it's okay. So once in a while, the only people who ever challenged me were STV and tried to shut me down on some obscure, I still don't know what copyright I was breaching. And you can often breach it, oddly enough, Lewis, on music.
Yes, I know.
Because there's music sometimes running in the background, and you may see that as irrelevant. But
Well,
somebody
actually, we had that problem here on Saturday. It was a wee bit of Delilah in the background. You could hardly hear the dash thing. But
So anyway, they shut it down. I was quite phlegmatic about it until it was becoming a problem. I've shut it down myself subsequently, because people people say, oh, keep it going as an archive. But nobody was viewing the archive, but I had to manage it. But Twitter was a far more interesting medium, because one, it forced me into brevity, being the most damningly accurate thing that's ever been said about me is a man who never uses a short word when a long word won't do. And I'm afraid that's true, and I try and avoid it and have resort to four-letter words. But Twitter, I realized early on it was not a medium for debate. And I was baffled, and still am, at why journalists and politicians, including frontline politicians, allow themselves to get into the most pointless exchanges and display a fit of pique worthy of any prima donna, that anybody should dare to question them, and go on in this tit for tat, which benefits nobody in neither side of the argument. It reflects badly. So I saw my role in Twitter was to clip links, to make comments, never to claim to represent either the SNP or the independence movement or anybody. I say, this is me, Peter Curran, voter, expressing my views as I have a right to do on events of the day. But occasionally I would engage with people because there were constructive discussions to be had, including with people who violently disagreed with me or disagreed with me. But Twitter offers all the tools of control that any rational tweeter needs. If you don't like what's been said, you can stop the conversation by simply exiting it. If the person continues to bombard you with communications, as some do because they want to keep it going endlessly, you can mute them. So they can still
rabbit on, but you don't have to.
They can still rabbit on. They're still being published. You haven't censored them or anything, but you don't have to see it. Mm-hmm. You know.
Now, I mean, how does this tie in with this thing that we started with? Obviously, we've got this young woman from the BBC. And you think to yourself, well, has she just fallen into a trap here? Or has she actually designed this to be something that's going to wind other people up? Of course, you can't know the answer to that question. But, I mean, you could see that within the indie community and with all the backlash against the BBC's Question Time programme recently, where they've obviously planted I shouldn't say that, where it seems they've planted some persons in the audience to be the unionist view of the world, and then the indie folk then on high alert for anything that might possibly confirm their suspicions. And then you get this young woman who's obviously trying to balance out her programme, and then you think, well, did she do it deliberately or did she? But then move on to the...
Well, I don't actually, to tell you the truth, I hadn't, for most of the time I was engaging with this recent debate, hadn't realised that was the root of it, because I picked it up at a later stage when people were commenting, cybernats must moderate what they say and the abuse is... Now, let me say very clearly here, I think something very serious and bad has happened to the political discourse. But it's being triggered by politicians at the very highest level in United Kingdom politics. They're the one that debased the coinage, not the ordinary man and woman in the street, but they gave a signal to the worst elements in their followers. And that has more to do with Brexit, the debasement of the debate, than it ever had to do with the Scottish independence debate. The Scottish independence debate was vigorous on both sides. There was abuse on both sides. Some of it was contemptible. The sexist abuse I cannot stand. I mean, it's quite appalling. It reflects not only badly on the people, it reflects on the male sex.
Yes, that's awful, isn't it? Yeah, I agree with that.
And it reflects a huge inadequacy in the men that perpetrate it.
And of course it is a
Something
very small
seriously
minority of people that do this, I'm sure.
Yes.
I mean, when the All Under One Banner people were marching down on Saturday, there were 44. Somebody told me that they counted them, unionist people shouting abuse. And then again, that's one of these other arguments that people try to blow up. And if you read the headlines, and people do only read the headlines, this is one of the problems with all of this stuff, because there are people who bother to sit and read the whole thing and read several different things and draw their own conclusions. But often people just see the headline.
Well, absolutely. You see, whoever coined the cybernet description, I will give them this. It was an inspired construct, because it linked into any number of things. Doctor Who, the Cybermen, the evil Nats in the sense of evil nationalism. And although the thing in itself was a simple factual statement, this is somebody operating in cyberspace, it means social media, as an independent supporter, it was immediately pejorative. There is no equivalent to hit back with. And not that I would want one. The last thing is I want that kind of tit for tat. The appalling misjudgment, dreadful misjudgment, I can't put words too strongly on it, was for people in the political echelons and supporting of the nationalist community to pick up that word, accept it as a pejorative term and apply it to their own supporters. Quite frankly, that's electoral and political lunacy. And a number of supporters have expressed their indignation of it. I mean, I don't know how four-letter words go there. God knows they abound on media, but I can't tell you this story without using one four-letter word. But if you've ever worked in a big factory, and I did...
I'll just say that the producer said carry on, just so I don't get blamed for it, okay?
Okay.
Carry on.
So I take full blame for this. I worked for the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company in Gerskaden. And it was a fascinating experience. American multinational opened up at the sort of peak when Scotland has a car industry to supply the local industry. And it was a big, dirty, very dangerous industry. Tire production is a dangerous industry. It uses inflammable substances, fine carbon black dust, which is subject to dust explosion. In many respects, it's a bomb. And a factory is a living organism. So it was this quarter-mile long factory. In the beginning of the process was something called the Banbury mixer, which mixed all the raw rubber from the plantations, the carbon black, synthetic rubber, chemicals, mixed this in an internal chamber and produced the rubber, which became the raw material for everything that followed, the tread of the tyre, the body of the tyre, etc. And we had a very active industrial relations environment. We had highly intelligent shop stewards who knew the power of leverage, operating in a piecework system with an American company who didn't understand British industrial relations. And they made the most of it, and it was a hard time. It was a vigorous environment. Now, a shop steward, one of the shop, I won't give him a name, he may still be around, and I offer him my greatest affection if he still is. But he was known as the Golden Bear because he worked stripped to the waist and he was covered in golden hair, which was coated in carbon black. So he was an exciting, bizarre sight. And every second word was the most commonly used four-letter word. He would say, good morning. And everybody knew that this, we'll call him Davy, this was Davy. But at one point he said to a manager, the manager had made a statement, and Davy said, "You're a liar." Now, from Davy, that was not an insult, it was not disrespectful, it was his normal mode of expression, vigorous. I don't agree with you. It's like a British civil servant saying with the greatest respect, which means I believe you're an asshole. You know, you've got to translate these words from the people that are using them. And he arraigned this guy on what the army would call on a charge, on a visit. He was being disciplined for this, and I advised against it. But it went all the way to the plant manager, the senior American personnel manager. All the shop stewards were brought in, and David was brought in before the committee. And it said, it's alleged that you called your manager a liar. So the full-time official jumped in, full-time officer union said, I will answer for that. David denies absolutely that he made any such statement. So the American personnel manager said, well, I guess I'd like to hear that from Dave. And he said, Dave, did you call Don a liar? And Davey said, no, he's a liar. And the whole thing dissolved in laughter, and the whole thing melted away. Now, I'm not saying there isn't vicious, nasty abuse, some of it which should be the subject of legal action and prosecution with the full rigour of the law. What Joanna Cherry, a fine MP, dedicated, a Queen's Counsel, has had to endure is appalling. Because this is active threats. It's not just abuse. Abuse is something, well, up to a reasonable point you should be able... I mean, American press, American law is much more tolerant of your right to say these things, providing you don't incite violence or threaten violence. So a division is not being made. And people who should know better on the nationalist side of the argument, I'm talking about people in positions of influence and power, there is a distinct whiff of it that they don't like a certain kind of criticism. And I'm afraid there are a number of journalists who have a far thinner skin than any journalist should have a right to have.
Of course, do you think that as the independence bubbles and bubbles, and you hear Nicola Sturgeon calling for another referendum, and the wider Yes movement, I mean, 100,000 folk through Glasgow on Saturday, it was fairly impressive.
Yeah.
Fairly impressive.
Yeah.
As this comes up, do you smell something of fear within those who would prefer to maintain the union? And do you think that this fear is, one of the manifestations of this is something of what we've been talking of today?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to use the term pejoratively. I mean, I accept, however hard it is for me to intellectually understand them, that there are people, Scots like me, who feel as passionately about the union and the preservation of the union and a lot that they see that goes with it, the monarchy, the link to something bigger, to long tradition. They feel every bit as passionately about it as me. And I have to accept that there'll be passionate expressions which stray into the intemperate on both sides. So put it this way, if the situation was reversed and it was the Unionists about to call a referendum to take independence away from an independent Scotland which already had it, I, as an independent supporter, would feel fear and would want to react with all the weapons in my armoury. You've got to expect that politics is politics, and it's adversarial. We operate under adversarial legal systems. They're structured to be that way. Party politics is adversarial, even within people who are on the same side of the arguments as we've seen. And referenda, I hate that term, I prefer referendums, are in their essence binary. We operate in a first-past-the-post system. So we've got to expect that the arguments are pursued with vigour. But there was a nightmare scenario unfolded some time ago, horrific. That was the murder of Joe Cox. And that was dreadful. I mean, it was dreadful beyond dreadful because she was such a fine young woman and respected across the political spectrum. Robbed a family of their mother prematurely in appalling circumstances. What I find almost more appalling than that act is people who have had somebody say something slightly nasty about them on Twitter, draw a parallel between that and Joe Cox's murder.
Yes, no, this
is, when you start, there are degrees of vigour. In the nicest possible terms, independence and anti-independence people would settle each bout with a refereed boxing match, or even better still, a darts match, providing they weren't aiming at each other. But we exist in adversarial politics. I have to say, some journalists, we have some fine journalists in Scotland of both types. My own nationalist friends say, oh, the mainstream media, they're all, I say, well, they're not all monsters. We have very responsible journalists. I mean, I would cite a journalist as being, I think, of the most responsible, and a fine political journalist. I don't know where his politics stand. I know where the normal Nat thinks his politics stand, and it's not on their side. And that's Tom Gordon of the Herald. I mean, Tom Gordon never written anything that didn't make sense to me. I often disagreed totally with his analysis or conclusions, but he's a fine analytical journalist. We have Ian McWhirter, who has never squarely identified with the nationalist movement, but would be seen to have been more balanced towards that side. We have other journalists who spin out 900 or 1,200 words on a regular basis, which could be said in a tweet. And they're simply looking for material and being offended, and as you said, finding something that's new. Cybernet, isn't that great? Can't we generate some controversy? I'm desperate to fill my midweek column for the Herald.
A bit of advertising,
pointing at anybody in that sense. Ordinary people, and I count myself as an ordinary person, have a very wide range of educational and expression skills open to them.
And of course, politics, the idea of politics is to stop us having wars. You know, you said that a few moments ago about the fight and that, and I remember visiting Borneo many years ago and hearing of how the Raj, in the days of the Raj, what was the name of the man? It's not in my head at the moment. But one way of solving this, people chopping each other's heads off and shrinking them, was to have a cockfight instead. So you get the two best chickens cockfights from each one, and you let them fight it out instead. And that's kind of way football works in a way, isn't it? You know, that represents, or can, maybe we best go down that particular alleyway, but you can see the point of what I'm trying to say, I suppose.
I do see it indeed, Lewis. If I can think of a parallel, I have to be careful how I express it. It's used by the major religions of the world. Mm-hmm. It's not that long in human terms where we sacrifice human beings on an altar, and at least one major church managed to bring a stop to that practice in certain violent areas by substituting a different kind of altar and a different kind of sacrifice, which was non-violent. So people can have their violent and their negative aspects sublimated in the right context.
Certainly, it is a point of using politics to allow us to speak to one another. And it should be that you can express your view and I can express my view without having to suffer abuse for that.
Well, let me give you one thing that Twitter comes in for a lot of stick. This is despite the fact that Twitter, I don't know the exact statistics, but has something about, affects it globally, about 1/15 of the number of people that are active on Facebook. Twitter is not a big thing, but it's a wonderfully easy target for journalists and analysts who want to criticize and accuse the other. People say, Twitter is a madhouse. Twitter is, if you can imagine, a huge pub in a city where everybody was allowed to come into this pub and shout their opinions vigorously. There would be blood coming out the windows. You'd be lucky to be able to draw a pint because there would be a mass fight. So we don't have that. We have a lot of little pubs, and you choose which pub you go into. And you don't normally choose to go into a pub where you know there'll be blood in the walls. If you're a Celtic supporter, you don't don the green and white and go into a hardcore Rangers pub in Ibrox, and vice versa. I mean, Scots have a bit of common sense. Twitter is exactly the same. You have the complete ability not only to choose the pub you go into, but to design the pub you want and to shut up the customers who you don't like and even eject the ones permanently that you don't like. Anybody who says I am being abused on Twitter, ask them this, how do you know you're being abused? Well, I want on Twitter and I've been abused. Why do you go there to be abused? I want to use the platform. In other words, I want to say what I have to say, but I want to inhibit someone else's ability to say it to me. And I say, if you don't like it, go else. But politician, I must have that general platform. Well, if you must have that general platform, go out and stand in a hustings and be prepared for the rotten tomatoes and the shouts and the obscenities and the odd person that leaps onto the stage and has a swing at you. If you're a rock band and you're a bit controversial, like the Sex Pistols, don't expect to go on stage and shout abuse and spit in the audience, not be spat back at. So
a smile gets a smile. And I think a little bit more empathy.
Or smile and the world smiles with you. Snarl and you get better service.
Do you know, I think we probably better draw this to a close, but on Saturday at the All Under One Banner March, we were making a programme there, and I had a point to go to the stage, and I seemed to have a backstage pass. They let me through anyway. There were two fine young women who'd been on the stage, and their music was very good, actually. I really enjoyed it. And they were very smiley and lovely, and they gave me their CD, which was all, I listened to it on the way to see you today, was all about happiness and wonderful little songs that made you feel better. And I think a smile gets a smile, a little bit more empathy, maybe a little bit more, let's hear what you've got to say rather than shout everybody down.
Indeed, Lewis, but I would point one thing. The All Under One Banner marches have been a model of exemplary behaviour.
They have.
And wholly on a volunteer basis. I mean, to have 100,000 people, or whatever the figure was, marching through the streets of Glasgow without a single incident is a formidable achievement. What is the response of the authorities to that? The police arrest the organiser or charge the organiser because they couldn't reach an agreement in the starting time. Where in God's name is there sense of proportion?
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe I should be careful.
We
need probably be a bit careful because I think this is a matter of the procurator fiscal, but I do understand what you're saying.
Yeah, what I know for certain is that the All Under One Banner marches must have included a large block of cybernats, none of whom were shouting abuse at anybody, swearing, threatening, engaging in sexist behaviour. And if the odd person gets a bit vigorous on Twitter, then they have the capacities. I often say things I regret on Twitter and do what I call a rapid delete. And often not rapid enough for the people who immediately get a screen grab and come back to. I live a relatively civilised life on Twitter, and yet nobody has deserved abuse more than me.
Well, that must be the end point. I don't think we should go on any further.
I don't know if that illuminated the discussion.
Well, I think that was absolutely magnificent, and I certainly am far more educated than when I walked in here earlier this evening. I'm very, very grateful for what you've said, and I hope that you out there in wherever we call it, television land, have been informed too. So I'm not quite sure. What day is it today? Wednesday?
It's Wednesday.
Now, tomorrow we have information that we really can't tell you about yet because we haven't got the final details. We're not actually sure if we can do anything with it yet, but we do hope we will be able to do something with it. So watch this space. It might be me, you might see Gordon, you might see somebody else, but that's the excitement that you can sit on the edge of your seat for and wait tomorrow evening at about 7 o'clock. Shall we say exactly 7 o'clock? We've actually started 2 shows bang on 7 o'clock, yesterday's and today's. So thanks very much for watching tonight. Thank you very much, Peter, for all the insight.
Thank you.
And thank you to Linda back in the control room and everybody else who puts Broadcasting Scotland together. Bye-bye.